Today, we're at Truett Seminary interviewing Reverend Dr. Wilhite on early patristics preaching. What kind of access do we have to sermons from this early church period?
Well, for the first, say, 300 years, we have hardly any. You can count about 5 different early Christian writers whose sermons survive, and for 4 of those, only one of their sermons survives. And then you get to Origen around 250s, we have a lot of his sermons, over 200 sermons. But before him, one sermon here, one sermon there, not many. And then when you get into the 4th century, that's when you start to have a lot of sermons. So Augustine's sermons have been collected, there's hundreds of them. Chrysostom's sermons have been collected, there's hundreds of them. Lots of collections like that come on the scene later.
After doing some background reading, it seems to me like the early church preaching style is very charismatic, very prophetic, and as Paul came around, things started to change, and it became more argumentative and trying to prove points. Do you agree with that consensus?
Yeah, so I think you could talk about the development of sermon styles. So you would see Jesus as a itinerant preacher, like John the Baptist. I mean, wherever he could gather crowds, he's preaching, probably impromptu. And you see evidence of this still happening in the earliest churches. Even Paul's churches that he's writing to, he seems to think this sort of thing is happening. It's very charismatic, very wherever the Spirit leads, whoever the Spirit leads. Paul is going to add in his letters very specific arguments, right? He's got pastoral problems he's dealing with. That seems to change his style. We assume his style of preaching was often dealing with that sort of thing. You can still see evidence of that into the 2nd century, where you have assumptions that people will stand up and prophesy, and that would have been very much a sermon, just an unplanned impromptu sermon.
So, do we know what role preaching played in the early church?
Yes, we actually know a good bit about preaching. So I mentioned that we don't have a whole lot of sermons from the earliest period, but we do have a lot of texts about sermons, or that talk about sermons. So the preaching would have been one of the central roles in the Christian gathering. So if you gathered in the evening for the agape meal, or whether you gathered on Sunday morning for the where it's strictly just the Eucharist, it's still the expectation that really what's happening is someone is opening for us the Scriptures, and that's in the earliest period primarily the Old Testament Scriptures, and then they are giving a proclamation, usually a moral exhortation. Here is what we Christians believe how we should live based on these Scriptures. So that would have been very essential. That's why people are expecting to hear this kind of preaching whenever they gather.
So what form did these sermons take in the early days of the church?
Yeah, so again, the form you could probably think of as developing a lot and changing a lot. But when you really start to look at, say, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century sermons, it was read, the passage of Scripture for the day was read by someone else, and then someone like Hippolytus or Origen or whoever's preaching stands up and simply goes verse by verse and talks about what those Scriptures mean, and often trying to pull out of them this is the character of God we see in Scripture, and therefore God's moral character should also have application to our lives. We should do this, we should live just lives, etc., etc.
Who was allowed to preach in the early church?
Again, early on, you would say anyone's allowed to preach. And what you have to allow for is when we talk about preaching, like there's just this one point on the order of service. In the earliest time period, it seems more like however people were led during the service to give a word. And that word might sound like teaching, and it might sound like prophecy, spirit-filled, exhortation. But anyone was allowed to do that. I mean, in the New Testament, even Paul is dealing with this problem in Corinth. Even women were allowed to stand up and do this. When you get to a more formal liturgical orders of service, it's assumed that only the clergy really give this message.